Well, good morning, everybody. Pleased to be with you this morning. I will be wrapping up today. This is the last class in a series focusing on the meaning behind Genesis 1:26. Let us make man in our image and likeness. Trying to understand exactly what that meant, how man was made in God's image, and what sort of perspective lessons I can teach us about what God's doing now and what his ultimate intention is for humankind. So just by way of brief review, we've had 3 classes so far. In the first class, we looked at the terminology. What are the meaning of the words image and likeness, the Hebrew words? Where else are they used? My conclusion was that these words can be used interchangeably to refer to physical appearance in kind of the primary sense, but that there are shades of meaning to words in Hebrew, as there is in any language, that they have a variety or spectrum of meanings, and that the physical representation isn't the only meaning they're limited to. I should acknowledge also that the image and likeness, some have suggested that they have specific meanings relative to one another as well. So my conclusion was that they're interchangeable, but I think there's other views on that as well. Class 2, we looked at some of these expressions that speak of God as if he has a physical form, right? So the hand of God, God talks about making his arm bare, like rolling up his sleeves, right? It's making his arm bare. Does God really have arms? Does he have a face that we can see? In many passages of Scripture, he is described in these kinds of human terms. So in class 2, we looked at really the significance of these expressions, their literary devices to help us understand God and how he acts, that he is in fact a personal God. He is relatable to us, even though he is an awesome God. He's vast, he's beyond human comprehension in so many other ways. He is portrayed kind of with these physical things, these human anatomy, if you will. So the main objective God has in revealing himself is to present his character. So hopefully the idea of image and likeness that we're supposed to be bearing, it's not just our appearance, how I part my hair, or these things that people see. We know that God is so much more concerned about the inward person and character development than he is on outward things. And then last week we looked at this idea of humankind being designed to bear God's image, and yet having fallen, having a nature which is prone to sin, we're not quite there, right? We have a lot of the capacity, we have the starting materials to be made in God's image, but we're not fully realized in that design intent, if that makes sense. So the objective of this class, and I think every class up until now I've been saying, wait until we get into the New Testament, wait until we look at Jesus. All of this becomes a little more clear, I think, when we see how scriptures speak of Jesus. Before we get there, though, and this will bring us there, remember we spent some time in Exodus 33 talking about how Moses spoke with God face to face as a man speaks to his friend. And just a few verses later, we see God say that no man can see my face and live, right? So how do you resolve that? And the suggestion was the idea of speaking to somebody face to face is to be in their presence. So Moses was speaking to God in the presence of God, but he couldn't actually see his face. Now, we do know that in time, God's presence did rub off on him. He had this glowing face. The skin of Moses' face shone, and they were afraid to come near him when he came down from the mount, it says in Exodus 34. This was, of course, the glory that would be passing away, right? This wasn't a permanent glory. It was sort of a temporary shine that rubbed off on Moses until it faded, and then he would go back into the presence of the Lord in the tent of meeting, and the shine would kind of reinitiate. So let's see. Now we get to the New Testament, and we see the disciples making a similar request of Moses. If you turn to John 14, Our brother Dave Hill brought us here during Bible class this week. John 14 and verse 6. Jesus said unto him, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father but by me. If ye had known me, you would have known my Father also. And from henceforth you know him and have seen him. Now here Philip says to him, Lord, show us the Father, and it sufficeth us. It's like, oh, we just want to see the Father. Show us the Father, Philip says. Jesus said, how have I been so long time with you, and yet you have not known me, Philip? He that has seen me hath seen the Father, and how sayest thou, then show us the Father? All right. So yeah, Brother Dave was focusing on the way. Jesus is the way. The truth is a living person. I am the way, the truth, and life. We don't have access to the Father without him. This is all beautiful stuff that he's teaching to his disciples. And then usually it's Peter that says the bonehead stuff, but this time it's Philip. He says, it's all really nice, but just show us the Father. Just cut to the chase. Show us the Father, and that'll be enough for us. And Jesus says, that's what I've been trying to show you. I have been trying to show you the Father. That's what I'm here to do. God isn't reclining on a cloud the way that, who did the Sistine Chapel? That was one of the Renaissance. Michelangelo, right? You know the one I'm talking about, where he's laying on the cloud and he's touching Adam or whatever, and there's all the baby angels and things. Ridiculous. That's not what God looks like. Even the way that Daniel saw him, the Ancient of Days, right? It describes his hair being white as wool, right? So this appearance of God. Even the Old Testament scriptural depictions of God are in some ways inadequate. It's in the character of Jesus Christ that we most closely see who God is. So, let's see here. God told Moses what he's like. Here's the scripture. When Moses asked to see the glory of God, God says, you can't see my face, but I'm going to show you my character. Merciful, gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, forgiving iniquity, transgression, sin, not clearing the guilty. So that's what God shows Moses, what God's like. Jesus shows humankind all of these attributes of God, but in the person. So instead of telling them what God's like, Jesus shows his disciples what God is like. And I thought this from Paul was really interesting in 2 Corinthians. For God, who said, let light shine out of the darkness, has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. So if you can see the reference to 2 Corinthians 3 on the left, right? There was Moses' face that had the shine on it that wore off, and it was terrifying to look at, and it was passing away. And then you have Jesus' face, which has the knowledge of the glory of God. So though the Israelites could not see the face of God, all of us are invited to gaze upon the face of Jesus, the glory of the knowledge of God that does not pass away, that is permanent and steadfast, that is not terrifying. It's a view that we can comprehend, we can understand. It's relatable. It's not terrifying. All of these are attributes of how Jesus manifests his Father. Any questions or comments on that? Who's got the mic? Who's got a question or comment first? Brother Chris, you're always good for one.
No, I've got the mic.
Okay. All right, I'll just bring you to one more in the context here. Hebrews 1, verse 3, where Jesus is described as the radiance of the glory of God, the exact imprint of his nature. The King James Version says the express image of his person. And I like the exact imprint of his nature, because imprint That to me, that kind of suggests a creative process, making an impression when you make an imprint. So the Greek word for imprint is character. You might say, hey, that's not a Greek word, that's an English word. We get it from the Greek. It was a Greek word first. So this word character, Strong's dictionary defines it as either the tool or the person. So you can think about somebody using a graver tool is themselves a graver, right? So they're using a tool to make an impression. So by implication, the word means an engraving itself, the figure stamped that is an exact copy or figuratively a representation. So you know how often there's a double meaning to words, right? So a character can be like the letters in the alphabet, right? The A looks like this. That's the character that's formed, right? But the double meaning is not only is it the thing that's formed, but it's the total kind of collection of attributes that make up a person as well, right? Your character is what you're like. All of your personality and behaviors, what people come to know of you, is your character. So I just wanted to bring up the online etymology dictionary, because this kind of distinction, this double meaning of the Greek, goes back pretty far. So again, talking about this word character, it's from the word charax, which means a pointed stake. You can imagine the engraving tool like a pointed steel instrument that can be used to make marks on a clay tablet. That's how, in very ancient times, they would communicate on tablets, like a stylus almost. Let's see, most probably pre-Greek. It came in Hellenistic times, so during the New Testament period, Hellenistic times. It came by metaphor to mean a defining quality, individual feature. So that defining quality or individual feature we might call a characteristic. And from then, and I think it says in the 1600s, it became not just an individual characteristics, but collection, which became our character. So this is the term used when Jesus is described as the exact imprint of God's nature. He is an expression of God's character. So again, going back to that idea of this being a creative term, it made me think about the process of like a hardened steel, like a mold or a die, creating an impression on a workpiece. I think of like an injection molding or casting process. Until very recently, I was working on a program at work to develop a pen injector instrument, and it had I think just 7 plastic molded components. So we worked with a supplier to create tools to produce these molded parts. So you could take that fluid plastic and injection mold it into a tool, and the tool would look like the part that you're trying to create, right? It's a mold or it's a casting. So the plastic is molten and it just conforms to whatever you're filling the plastic into. I actually have a picture here of a die that was used to manufacture a Lego. So this is an 8-cavity tool. You can see there are 8 positions. It's a 2-sided, right? Because there's a bottom and a top to every part. So you can see the part on the left side there is forming the impression that's on the bottom of the Lego. On the right side, you can see the Legos are still in, looks like 5 of the 8 cavities. So you can see all those features on the underside of the Lego are created by the tool on the left. So it just got me thinking about this process that we use for all sorts of created parts, all kinds of manufactured goods today, and from much earlier times even, are created using a similar process. And I wonder if this is the sort of thing that Scripture is trying to invoke in our minds, that there's sort of a master, I don't want to call it a copy, but sort of the thing that all other things come from, right? This tool, you can see the placard at the bottom, 120 million Legos were manufactured using this tool. And so those 8 cavities, they're the original ones. Every single piece can be traced back to this piece of equipment. And it got me thinking about God and how Jesus, as the firstborn of the new creation, is the first part off the tool. Whenever we purchase a tool at work, the first time you run it in the press and you shoot the hot plastic into it, it's called first off tool, right? So that first piece is the first off tool piece, and you look at it and you measure it and you make sure it's conforming to all the design specifications, because until that time there was only ever a plan. There's only ever an engineering drawing with the schematics and the measurements, and it's got to be this high and this wide, and you can't have any burnishes or blemishes. It was all theoretical until the first off tool, which, you think about this. Jesus is the Word made flesh, and God's master plan to create this perfect human being in his image, the one who is going to be the model for every other human being that follows him. It seems like a pretty good metaphor to me. So, yeah, go ahead.
So when you get to the idea of imprint, that certainly sparked the idea of the scriptural concept of being sealed in the forehead. And I recall a study on that where it was like the wax imprint of the king to seal his letters, okay, that they would put that wax seal on the letter to authenticate that this was from the king. So, Revelation speaks of the saints being sealed in the forehead, that imprint was put upon them, and that's the, I believe, the image of Jesus Christ, which, and the word face obviously connects us to the four faces of the showbread, in the temple, and of course the Gospels of the eagle and the ox and the lion and the man, so showing those aspects of God in manifestation. So.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, no, I agree. It makes a lot of sense. We should be recognizable by that image, right? Like it authenticates us as belonging to God. Yeah, I like that. Any other comments? Yes. Hey, Nancy, good to see you. Let's see. So carrying on. Oh, I think the other thing, just we're talking about this metaphor analogy. There's a lot of things that can go wrong in this molding process too. There's a lot of defects if the plastic doesn't totally fill in the cavity. The parts that come off, if they're still hot, they can warp. So there is a sense in which even going through a process like this, it's, the first time is not always quite right. So I think we're all kind of continuously going through this process. So let's get into some more of the scriptures here. The next one I wanted to bring in was Colossians chapter 1. And this is a good one to look at. I've just got an excerpt here, but the whole text is really helpful. Yeah, so Colossians chapter 1, verse 15, he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. Right off the bat, I think it's pretty clear that this passage is using creation language, right? The image of God, right? That brings us back to Genesis 1:26, image and likeness. The firstborn of all creation, well, there's an explicit reference to creation here. I wanted to share this comment from Brother John Launchbury. Let's see here. So in Genesis, when God said, "Let us make man in our image," I don't think he was talking just about a single act long ago. I think he was declaring his creative work through the ages when he is creating men and women to be like him. God's work has always been to manifest himself in living beings, to create us to be in his image. Jesus is the first man to be perfectly completed in the image of God. At his resurrection, the creative work of his Father was finished as far as his Son was concerned. His Son, one of us, but also fully in the image of God, and so worthy to receive the authority of his Father. So, firstborn of all creation does not mean that Jesus' creation preceded Adam and the animals. It's not talking about the Genesis 1 creation. It's talking about the new creation, the continual work of transformation that God is working in mankind. So Jesus is the first of the new creation. He's the first to be perfected in God's image. So I think I agree with it. I think this is a pretty good summary of what Scripture is trying to tell us. Truly, God did make man in his image way back when in Genesis 1. But since then, there's been a need to perfect the image of God in man. And that's what Jesus is, the firstborn of all creation. It's that new creation, that perfected creation. Right? So, let's see. So if we look at the wider context here, the image of the invisible God, firstborn of all creation, by him all things were created. What's it mean that by him, we're talking about Jesus, by Jesus all things were created? People get all wound up about what this means. There's all kinds of confusion. All things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. Well, in Genesis 1, there weren't any thrones or dominions. There weren't any human principalities on the earth to be created. So I think that should suggest this is talking about a future sort of creation. All things were created through him and for him. So the word image here, Brother David Levins had this series in the Tidings magazine about how you're not supposed to say Greek words if you're not if you're not qualified to do so. Mispronouncing Hebrew words, I think, probably gets to folks who actually know what the Hebrew words mean. And so we're not trying to say that. The only connection here is that this word image or icon, it's kind of like the icons on your desktop, right? Like your computer has computer icons, or little pictures of what the application is, right? It's a representation of something else. It comes from this Greek word translated image here, icon. It's the same word in the Greek Old Testament in Genesis 1:26. Let's make man in our image and likeness. Its image is icon. So there's a connection there. More significantly, though, I think, is that Christ is the one who comes to take charge of all thrones and dominions and powers, right? So this is Jesus exercising the original mandate God gave to humankind to have dominion over all of the earth. So when we're reading Colossians 1, this should bring us back to that creation language in Genesis, and we should be thinking about how Jesus serves a role in fulfilling the original design intent of creation. And that includes bearing God's image, but also includes having dominion over the rest of the earth. We talked about last week that mankind, the status of mankind is above the animals in some sense, that man is presently bearing God's image in some sense, but not fully until Jesus Christ comes and shows us the perfect image and takes dominion over all of the earth. Think about Philippians 2. It talks about every knee shall bow at the name of Jesus. Every tongue confess that he is Lord to the glory of God. That's not fully happened yet. So in some ways, I think Christ has been perfected in his character, but fulfilling this mandate to have dominion over all of the earth, that is still happening, right? That won't be completed until the kingdom age. All right, so we've got that. I would say also, we're talking about imaging God. Yeah, go ahead, Brother Steve.
Yeah, Ben, I thought that was really helpful, looking at Colossians 1 and 15 and 16 and showing that, the way you've highlighted the thrones and dominions, that this is not referring to sort of the first creation, but this is referring to a future creation. Really helpful to see that highlighted that way. And then particularly showing the Genesis 1 comment there to the right on the slide, where you see that God's purpose was that man would have dominion over all the earth. So yeah, so if I hear what you're saying, God created the earth so that man would represent him, that man would take God's character and sort of spread it over the earth. man didn't do that fully. And so there's this future creation that Jesus comes and perfectly represents God, bears God, the icon of God, if you will.
Right.
And that the reference then to thrones and dominions is the future age. Am I with you?
That's how I understand it, yeah.
Yeah, really helpful. Thanks.
Yeah.
Nice to see it presented that way.
And to go along with what Steve said, that's why God created the nation of Israel. They were supposed to represent, be witnesses of God to the rest of the nations, and this is part of what we'll be picking up next week in the classes, a little bit of where Ben is, and we're going to continue on that. So, before Jesus, there was Israel, and we know they also failed to represent God on the earth. So, just a little side note.
Yeah. Thanks, Mark. Good segue into your classes next week. So this process is underway in us, the process that worked in Jesus. Putting on the new self, on screen there, Colossians 3:9-10. Paul is saying that basically the status that we have now, it's supposed to affect our behavior presently, right? We're not supposed to be lying to one another anymore because we've put off the old self. Old self was a liar. The new self does not lie. It tells the truth. You put off the old self with its practices. You put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge after the image of its creator. So I wonder here when after the image of its creator, well, what's creator? Its creator. What are we talking about? Sorry, I got to catch up to my notes here. So what is the it in its creator? It's the new self. So the new self has a creator. The old self is passing away. We're putting on the new self. I wonder if it's Jesus himself that is the new creator of the new creation. When it says in the Colossians chapter 1, what we just looked at, it says by him all things were created. So it's saying that Jesus has a role in creation. Now we reject the idea that there was a pre-existing Christ or anything like that back in the Genesis 1 period that helped God with the original creation. Now we're thinking in spiritual terms about this new creative work that God is doing through Christ. And Jesus appears to have a role in that, in creating putting on the new self. It's just a thought here, but you have to ask, who is the creator? What did Jesus create? Colossians 1 verse 15. Regardless, what we're talking about is, to get back to the image and likeness thing, we're not talking about physical representations of God. We're not even talking about the divine nature. We're talking about really practical, relatable things that Jesus teaches us to do. If we're in Colossians 3, looking at how we are being renewed in knowledge after the image of its creator, he keeps saying, put on, be renewed. Here are the things we're supposed to put on. In just a few verses later, Colossians 3, verse 12-14. He says, put on compassionate hearts, put on kindness, put on humility, meekness, patience, bearing with one another, forgiving each other, even as Christ forgave you. And above all these things, put on love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. And I think sometimes our expectation is that we're going to have some kind of experience like Moses on Mount Sinai or Ezekiel having the vision by the canal. It's going to be this otherworldly thing, this thing totally outside of human experience. But really, image bearing is about doing these kind of ordinary things that are actually extraordinary, which are actually very rare in the world, like having compassionate hearts, being kind, being humble. These are not things that come natural, and for that reason, they are extraordinary. I think we should be looking at these sorts of characteristics that God has revealed to us through Jesus and say, wow, that's amazing. And we do see that in our community. We have wonderful brothers and sisters. I can think of so many folks who have influenced myself, and Sister Hannah, I'm sure you can as well for yourself. Just really extraordinary examples of disciples who have influenced us and shown us the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ as it's been imprinted onto them. Philip, when he says, just show us the Father. And Jesus is like, that's what I've been doing. What do you expect to see? We think of these awesome moments like the Transfiguration, where God reveals his glory in a way that's really striking to human beings, but that's not what it's all about, really. So hopefully that makes sense. So Colossians is a great place to go for this. It's really tragic that some people go in different directions with a passage like this. But I think as we do the imaging study, we can kind of see there is sort of a higher spiritual meaning to these things. The whole concept of the new creation it really is supposed to be a radical thing. So any questions on Colossians 1? Any comments on these passages before we move on? All right. Let's see. So the next one is Philippians chapter 2. This is another one that's kind of hard to read without reacting to the misunderstanding. We're not going to be refuting the preexistence or deity of Christ or anything like that. That's not what we're here to talk about. But I do want to focus in on this bit about Jesus, who was in the form of God. He did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant. I couldn't find any basis for the ESV's being born. I think King James, he was made in the likeness of man, is fine. Maybe that's reference to how he was born, maybe not. Being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Therefore God has highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name. It's the name that we just talked about, that has dominion over the earth, essentially. This is another passage that seems to be directly referencing the Genesis account, right? Equality with God, a thing to be grasped, does seem to suggest Eve grasping for the forbidden fruit that would give them the knowledge of good and evil, just as the Elohim had, right? And they say, the man's going to become like one of us, right? So grasping for equality does seem to be a reference to Adam and Eve's behavior. So think about the things that the devil promised to Jesus in the wilderness. He said, you can have all the kingdoms of the earth, and Jesus might have said, well, hey, I'm God's son. I'm entitled to these things. I should reach out and take them. That would be seeking to have equality with God. I think Eve could have also rationalized, hey, God made me in his image. God wants me to have this knowledge of good and evil. You can easily justify that in your mind. But unlike Adam and Eve, Jesus acknowledged the likeness of men in which he was born, and it was only by being the representative of mankind, being found in human form, that he could humble himself by being obedient to the point of death, so that God could exalt him in due time. He was ultimately exalted, but the exaltation came from God. It was not something that he grasped for himself, if that makes sense. Brother Chris.
His baptism, at which point he received the power of God without measure, and so he wasn't born with this nature of being in the form of God. This is something that took place during his life following his baptism, and of course it came with the great temptation to use this power to serve self, which he dealt with in the wilderness. So I think that helps get an idea where this grasping would have taken place at age 30, not at his birth as a child.
Okay, yeah, that's helpful. Any other comments? Just got a few more minutes here, so I think we'll do one more. Romans chapter 8. For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, in order that he might be the firstborn among many brothers. Those whom he predestined, he also called, and those whom he called, he also justified. Those whom he justified, he also glorified. So being conformed to the image of God's Son and glorification, both of those things, both of those end results come from a process that begins with God's foreknowledge, right? He foreknows to be conformed to the image. He foreknows that he may predestine and call and justify and ultimately glorify his people. So I think this passage is connecting confirmation to the image of Jesus, right, who's the perfect image of the Father. That's connecting that to glorification. So this is definitely something that we're working towards. We're not quite there yet, but I do see this as, again, going back to the Lego tool, right? Jesus is the first one. He's the firstborn among many brothers. And so, all of these parts that were made in the same image come afterwards. So Romans 8 is definitely picking up on the same idea here. I don't think we need to go through all this. Okay, so to put it quite simply, Jesus is the express image of God. He's the pattern to follow. I've just put a collection of verses here which show that we are supposed to behave as Christ did, to walk as he walked, to do as he did, to love as Christ loved, to forgive as the Lord has forgiven us, to have the mind just as Christ did. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you may follow in his steps. So, there's a lot I've learned from this study. It hasn't always been easy going, but ultimately, God had a vision for his creation right from the very beginning. He had a vision for what he wanted to do with humankind, that he wanted them to bear his image and likeness. And like Brother Steve was saying, I think this was the idea here was for the whole calling for man to be fruitful and multiply the earth, was to propagate the image of God throughout all of creation, so that Moses doesn't have to go into the mountain and ask to see God. Instead, we can see God in the image of Jesus Christ, and hopefully those of us who are being formed in that image can represent the image of God to others as well, right? So you don't have to go to this remote place to experience God's presence. You can experience the presence of God when you're with the children of God who are bearing his image, just the way that, remember how Seth is said to have borne Adam's image and likeness. So God is still working in creation. There's that whole concept of God as the clockmaker having wound up creation and he just lets it go. I don't think that's quite accurate when you see the work that Jesus is doing as the firstborn of the new creation, continuing to work transformation in the lives of believers. We do have to, I would say, be convinced that God is presently working in our lives, in our community, in our ecclesias, with our young people, in ourselves personally. If we lose that sense of God's involvement, I think that would be disastrous. But we should see ourselves as bearing God's image to some extent and trying to progressively work to bear it just as Jesus did. We're not going to get there perfectly in this life, but that's the standard that we're to follow. Jesus is the pattern. So, any comments or questions before we wrap? Yes. Oh, Mike's coming.
You say it's like the plan from the beginning, but if man had not sinned and eaten of that tree, would there have been a need for Christ? Or is that a totally separate? There would be no need for him to save us.
Yeah, no, that's.
Do you know what I mean?
Well, that's not what happened. I can't really speculate about
know,
alternate scenarios, but I think that it's part of the creation process. God doesn't tell us exactly what happened on days 1 through 6, right? We have the Genesis 1 and 2 accounts, but the exact details of how it's happening, we're spared those. We have a lot more detail about what God is working in humankind and how he has developed man to bear his image and likeness, because it's been a process that's taken thousands and thousands of years to get where we are, and it's taken Jesus Christ to do that. So in some ways, we have so much more detail about the creative process of human beings. I'm not saying that we're in day 6 right now, but God is continuing to work, and I would say that the creation in some ways is still unfolding. Yeah. Does that help at all?
And I think we have evidence to Judy's question in the creation account, and there are subtle things that, if we look at, are showing us this, that Jesus by no means was an accident or a second thought or a corrective action, but it was right from the very, very beginning. And so such things as the evening and the morning were the first day. It was showing us that God knew that darkness would first come, that man would reflect this in darkness before the light would come, okay? And that the source of this light, the sun, the moon, the stars, does not appear until the 4th day, which the creation account is kind of broken into 2 3-day parallel accounts. First a dark manifestation, and then the true light will come. So light out of darkness is a principle of God, but that darkness would prevail first, and that was the need. So it's to the honor, praise, and glory of God that he provided his only begotten Son because he so loved us. Nothing to do with us, okay? But to Judy's point, we certainly want to say we can clearly see in the 6-day account, it was not an accident. God foreknew this. He planned it. And, so the question sometimes goes to Adam's worst sin, not that he simply sinned, but that he wouldn't take responsibility for the sin, was a process that he had to come to acknowledge. He first blamed. So God knew that this darkness was latent in man and would have to come out first. So it was, shown to us that it was not an afterthought or Jesus came to correct something that God didn't plan, that he knew it was going to happen.
Yeah, thanks for that, Chris.